In 2011, a horrifying crime sent shockwaves through the Arlington community. A young pastor was brutally murdered in his own church. Now, years later, justice has finally been served. This is the chilling story of Pastor Clint Dobson and the man responsible for his tragic death, Stephen Nelson. NorthPointe Baptist Church was more than just a building. It was a sanctuary for many, a place of faith, unity, and community. Nestled in the heart of Arlington, Texas, it was a haven where people found solace in their beliefs. But on one fateful day in 2011, that sense of peace was shattered forever. March 3, 2011, began like any other day at NorthPointe Baptist Church in Arlington, Texas. Inside, 28-year-old Pastor Clint Dobson sat in his office, immersed in his daily work, preparing sermons, organizing church activities, and offering guidance to those who sought it. He was a man dedicated to his faith, a leader beloved by his congregation, and someone who had devoted his life to serving others. But on this day, his sanctuary would turn into the scene of a brutal crime. At some point during the afternoon, an unknown figure entered the church. Whether Pastor Dobson sensed danger right away or believed it was just another visitor seeking help, we may never know. But what is certain is that the moment this individual stepped inside, the church was no longer a place of peace. It became a crime scene. A violent confrontation broke out. The details of those harrowing moments remain deeply unsettling. Pastor Dobson, completely unarmed and unprepared for the horror that unfolded, found himself facing an assailant with no regard for human life. What should have been an ordinary day in a house of worship turned into a nightmare, one that ended in unspeakable violence. By the time the attack was over, the young pastor, who had dedicated his life to guiding others, lay lifeless. The walls that had once echoed with prayers and hymns now held the weight of an unimaginable tragedy. But this wasn't just an act of violence. It was something far more chilling. The attack was calculated, ruthless, and devastatingly final. As the hours passed and the church remained eerily silent, the reality of what had happened was about to be uncovered. The search for justice had just begun, and authorities would soon uncover a shocking truth about the man behind the crime. As the sun began to set on March 3, 2011, the silence inside NorthPointe Baptist Church became deafening. Hours had passed since the attack, and the horror that had unfolded within its walls remained unknown to the outside world. But that would soon change. Later that day, Church Secretary Judy Elliott was found inside the building, barely clinging to life. She had been severely beaten, suffering grave injuries that left her unconscious. The brutal nature of her wounds told a terrifying story. Whoever had done this hadn't just come to steal, they had come to destroy. But the true horror was yet to be discovered. As responders searched the church, they found Pastor Clint Dobson. He was lifeless. A plastic bag had been tightened around his head, leaving no chance for survival. It was a deliberate act, a method meant to ensure his final moments were filled with fear and suffering. What had started as an ordinary day inside a place of worship had turned into a scene of devastation. The church, once filled with love and faith, was now the site of an unspeakable crime. A community pastor was dead, his secretary lay battered and broken, and the most chilling question of all remained: who could have done this, and why? As authorities rushed to the scene, an investigation was set in motion, but no one was prepared for the shocking revelations that were about to unfold. As news of the horrific crime spread, investigators worked tirelessly to piece together what had happened inside NorthPointe Baptist Church. The brutal nature of the attack left the community in shock, but law enforcement was determined to find the person responsible. It didn't take long for detectives to focus on a primary suspect, 24-year-old Stephen Nelson. Nelson was no stranger to law enforcement. He had a history of legal troubles, and his past encounters with the justice system painted a picture of a man with a violent streak. But what would drive him to commit such a ruthless act inside a church? Investigators needed solid evidence to link him to the crime. As police followed the trail, they found undeniable proof. Stolen items belonging to the victims were discovered in Nelson's possession. Among them was Pastor Clint Dobson's laptop, one of the key pieces of evidence that placed him at the scene. Additionally, Judy Elliott's credit cards had been taken and were also found in his possession. These discoveries confirmed what investigators already suspected. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It was an undercurrent of sex and violence. Nelson had entered the church with the intent to rob, but it had escalated into something far more heinous. With mounting evidence against him, authorities wasted no time in tracking Nelson down. He was arrested and charged with capital murder, a charge that carried the ultimate consequence, the possibility of the death penalty. His arrest sent shockwaves through the community, but it also brought a sense of relief. The man responsible for taking an innocent life inside a house of worship was now in police custody. But even as justice seemed to be on the horizon, the case was far from over. What led Steven Nelson to commit such a horrific crime, and would he face the full weight of the law for his actions? The trial that followed would be just as chilling as the crime itself. As the case moved to trial, the weight of justice loomed over Steven Lowain Nelson. The prosecution was determined to ensure that Pastor Clint Dobson's murder would not go unpunished. With a mountain of evidence and a devastated community watching closely, the courtroom became the stage for a chilling legal battle. During the trial, prosecutors laid out a compelling case against Nelson, leaving little room for doubt. They presented key forensic evidence, fingerprints and DNA, that directly linked him to the crime scene. Investigators confirmed that his fingerprints were found on crucial pieces of evidence, and DNA samples further solidified his presence inside NorthPointe Baptist Church on that fateful day. The prosecution also introduced testimony from law enforcement officers and forensic experts who detailed the brutality of the attack. They painted a grim picture of what had unfolded, an unprovoked act of violence that turned a robbery into a senseless murder. The jury listened intently as the chilling details were revealed. Knowing the verdict they reached would determine whether Nelson would pay the ultimate price for his crimes. As the trial progressed, the courtroom remained tense. Would Nelson show remorse for his actions? Or would he deny responsibility for the crime that had shattered an entire community? With overwhelming evidence against him, the case seemed clear-cut, but the question remained: what sentence would he receive? The answer would send shockwaves through the courtroom. When it was time for the defense to present its case, Steven Lowain Nelson took the stand. His testimony was a desperate attempt to shift the blame. Nelson claimed that he was not the one who carried out the brutal attack. Instead, he insisted that he had only served as a lookout while two other men committed the murder. But the jury wasn't convinced. Prosecutors quickly dismantled his story, pointing to the overwhelming physical evidence: his fingerprints, DNA, and possession of the victim's stolen belongings. There was no sign of these so-called other men. The prosecution argued that Nelson was the sole perpetrator, and the crime was not just an accident. It was an intentional act of violence. As the trial neared its end, the weight of Nelson's actions became undeniable. The jury now held his fate in their hands. After deliberating on the case, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty of capital murder. It was a decisive ruling, confirming what prosecutors had argued from the start. Nelson was responsible for the brutal killing of Pastor Clint Dobson. With the guilty verdict in place, the next question was the sentence. Given the severity of the crime, the prosecution pushed for the harshest punishment available. In October 2012, the court delivered its final judgment. Steven Lowain Nelson was sentenced to death. For the family and friends of Pastor Dobson, the verdict was a step toward justice, but no sentence could ever undo the pain of losing a beloved leader. The Arlington community, still shaken by the crime, hoped that this outcome would bring some measure of closure. However, Nelson's story didn't end there. Over the years, he would continue to make headlines from behind bars, but as his execution date loomed, The final chapter of his life was already written. For Stephen Lawrence Nelson, the fight for his life didn't end with the guilty verdict. Over the years, his defense team launched a series of legal appeals, determined to overturn his death sentence. They argued that Nelson had been denied a fair trial, citing claims of ineffective legal representation and questioning the reliability of the evidence presented against him.
Texas' first execution of 2025 took place earlier tonight in Huntsville. Stephen Nelson received a lethal injection and was pronounced dead just before 7 o'clock tonight. Back in 2012, Nelson was sentenced to death for killing a Baptist pastor from Arlington named Clint Dobson. Nelson, the first Texas death row inmate to be executed since Robert Robertson's execution was delayed back on October the 17th. That would have been the first execution in the United States, tied to the diagnosis of shaken baby syndrome. As of tonight, Robertson has not received a new execution date.
His attorneys challenged key aspects of the prosecution's case, questioning whether the forensic evidence was as conclusive as it seemed. They also attempted to cast doubt on witness testimonies, claiming inconsistencies in the investigation. But despite these efforts, each appeal faced strong opposition from prosecutors, who maintained that Nelson had received a fair and just trial. As the legal battle continued, Nelson remained on death row, waiting for a final decision that would determine whether his sentence would be upheld or if he would get another chance in court. As the years passed, Stephen Lawrence Nelson exhausted every legal avenue available to him. His defense team continued to challenge the verdict, taking their case to higher courts, hoping for a reversal or a reduced sentence. But appeal after appeal was denied. In a last-ditch effort, Nelson's attorneys brought his case before the U.S. Supreme Court, arguing that his trial had been flawed and that he deserved another chance. However, the highest court in the nation saw no merit in his claims. The Supreme Court ultimately denied Nelson's final appeal, sealing his fate and paving the way for his execution. With no more legal options left, the countdown to Nelson's final moments began. The man convicted of brutally taking Pastor Clint Dobson's life would now face the consequences of his actions. After years of legal battles and appeals, the justice system had reached its final decision. On February 5, 2025, Stephen Lawrence Nelson was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. As he was led into the execution chamber, the weight of his crimes loomed over him. The brutal murder of Pastor Clint Dobson had left a lasting scar on the Arlington community, and now the state was carrying out the ultimate punishment. Witnesses, including members of the victims' families, gathered to see the sentence carried out. Some hoped for closure, while others reflected on the tragic chain of events that had led to this moment. As Nelson lay on the gurney, he was given the opportunity for final words. What he chose to say, or if he chose to remain silent, will forever be a part of the record of this case. At 6:27 p.m., the lethal injection was administered. Within minutes, he was pronounced dead. For the family and friends of Pastor Clint Dobson, the execution marked the end of a long and painful chapter. But no punishment could ever bring back the life that was taken. The community that once mourned their beloved pastor now faced a somber reality. Justice had been served, but the scars of this tragedy would never fully fade. As the execution chamber fell silent, Stephen Lawrence Nelson was given one final opportunity to speak. Witnesses held their breath, waiting to hear his last words. Turning to his wife, Nelson expressed his love, his voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. He stated that he was at peace, accepting his fate with a sense of finality. Whether his words were an attempt at redemption or simply a farewell to those he cared for, they marked the last chapter of his turbulent life. At 6:27 p.m., the lethal injection was administered. Within minutes, Nelson was pronounced dead. For the family of Pastor Clint Dobson, this was the moment they had waited for. A final act of justice for the man whose life was cruelly taken. But for many, the execution did not erase the pain, nor did it bring back what was lost. It was simply the closing of a dark and tragic chapter. The murder of Pastor Clint Dobson left an unshakable void in the Arlington community. Those who knew him, his family, friends, and congregation, struggled to come to terms with the senseless act of violence that took his life. Pastor Dobson was more than just a religious leader. He was a guiding light for many. He was remembered for his compassion, his unwavering faith, and his dedication to uplifting those around him. His congregation at NorthPointe Baptist Church was devastated, mourning not just a pastor, but a friend and mentor. In the wake of his death, candlelight vigils were held, and heartfelt tributes poured in from all who had been touched by his kindness. The tragedy served as a painful reminder of how fleeting life can be, and how violence can rip apart even the most peaceful of communities. For his family, the grief was immeasurable. They spoke of Clint's dreams, his love for ministry, and the impact he had made in such a short time. Justice may have been served, but their loss could never truly be healed. For the families of Pastor Clint Dobson and Judy Elliott, the pain of that tragic day never faded. The loss was immeasurable, and no verdict or sentence could ever bring back what was taken from them. In the wake of Steven Nelson's execution, the families shared their reflections. Some spoke of the deep sorrow that remained, of the empty space left behind by their loved ones. Others found solace in the justice that had been served, believing that Nelson's punishment was the rightful consequence of his actions. But in a remarkable display of faith and forgiveness, some extended grace even toward the man responsible for their suffering. They acknowledged the gravity of his crimes, but also recognized the power of redemption, choosing to let go of hatred rather than allow it to consume them. Their words were a testament to the strength of the human spirit, one that, even in the face of unimaginable loss, could still find a way to embrace forgiveness. The tragic events at NorthPointe Baptist Church serve as a somber reminder of the fragility of life and the enduring strength of faith and community. What happened on that fateful day not only took the life of a devoted pastor, but also left a lasting scar on those who knew and loved him. Yet, through the pain and loss, the community of Arlington came together, bound by their shared grief, their faith, and their determination to honor Pastor Clint Dobson's legacy. His memory lives on, not just in the hearts of those he touched, but in the lessons of compassion, forgiveness, and resilience he embodied. The case of Steven Nelson is one of justice served, but it also raises profound questions. Can justice truly bring closure? Can forgiveness triumph over pain? And how can communities protect themselves from such tragedies in the future? What are your thoughts on this case? Do you believe justice was rightfully served? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more in-depth true crime stories. Until next time, stay safe and stay informed.